This episode is brought to you by Dogfish Head Craft Brewery. The Grateful Dead and Dogfish Head have gotten the band back together with the release of Grateful Dead Juicy Pale Ale, a light-bodied pale ale brewed with sustainable kernza grains, granola, and heaps of good karma for a refreshing brew that's music to your taste buds. Available nationwide, visit dogfish.com to find Grateful Dead Juicy Pale Ale in your neck of the woods. Dogfish Head Craft Brewery is located in Milton, Delaware. Please drink responsibly.
Culture evolves at the speed of light, just like your financial needs. When it comes to your money, Credit Karma keeps you in the know and ahead of the game. You can count on Credit Karma to keep up with your financial needs as they evolve. We'll help you monitor your progress and give personalized recommendations so you can make strides towards your goals and find your way to money. Intuit Credit Karma. Karma you can count on. Download the app today.
Good morning is mine, a throwaway piece of garbage, I always thought.
It's just not one of my favourite pieces because, you know, at the same time I wrote Mr. Kite and Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds and Day in the Life. So if you line them up against those three, Good Morning doesn't really stand up. So that's why I don't have much of a feeling about it, you know. But it's fun, the kind of, the sound effects and the, by the way, it was from a Kellogg's commercial.
Hello and welcome to episode 267 of Something About the Beatles. And this is a return visit from Jack Petrozelli. You know him from the Fab Four, as well as a number of musicians he has worked with and recorded and toured with, including Joan Osborne and Patti Smith and Rufus Wainwright and, go to his website. He can fill you in on all that stuff. As well as Cameron Greider, who's also been on the show with Jack before, also worked with Rufus as well as Sean Lennon, a number of other luminaries, and Beatles scholar, musicologist Walter Everett. Together they are part of the faculty at the RPM School, which you may know from the previous appearances on SATB, which will be kicking off their fall semester in October very soon. You can check the link on the SATB website at somethingaboutthebeatles.com, and also check out the site if you haven't seen it since it was revamped recently, and we'll give you all the information about the upcoming class, which is centering on Sgt. Pepper. We've done any number of shows on Pepper, probably will continue, but this is a fresh angle that they came to me with as deep diving musicians, Beatles scholars, people that think deeply and analyze deeply this music. And of course, everyone knows Pepper's my favorite album, but it's a fresh angle to come at this album on and sort of counter to what the conventional wisdom has been about this album, specifically about the input of which Beatles on it, and how really, based on their analysis, which you're about to hear, how underneath it all, it's really a guitar album, which might be counter to what you think when you think about Pepper and the production and instrumentation and full use of the studio that we all think about when we think about the Sgt. Pepper album. But they strip it away and drill down layers upon layers of this album, and you'll get to hear some of that stuff and their analysis of it. So who better to do this with than these guys who have spent so much time thinking, analyzing, deconstructing this music, performing it, and at the RPM School, you can join in for an analysis and actually get some hands-on activity with this stuff. I should also like to point out that Walter has a new book just out this year. You may be familiar with his 2 volumes that came out, I think, in the 90s, or at least early 2000s, The Beatles as Musicians, Volume 1 and Volume 2. He's got a new book out now, not Beatles-centric per se, but interesting nonetheless, Sex and Gender in Pop Rock Music, The Blues Through the Beatles to Beyonce. So that is his latest work. It is an analysis and examination, representations of sexuality in popular music, evaluating lyric structure, symbolic language of these artists, an overall emphasis on how pop music, while a commodity art form, reflects the diversity of human sex and gender. What could be more timely in the age we're living in? In any event, our discussion on Sgt. Pepper, the guitar album.
I always like to hear Robert's take on Pepper because you are such a passionate advocate for Revolver as being the album. And I'm wondering if that's something that is a problem for you with Pepper, that the rock band gets obscured a little bit.
I probably have less of a problem with Pepper than people think I do, just because I think when my book came out, there were some editorial changes that kind of pushed it a little harder on Pepper and left out some of the good stuff I had to say. But that being said, I think that there's something about Pepper that makes it very special and sort of a one-off, because it was them freed of any kind of commitment to ever playing live again. So that was not the case when they made Revolver. They still had another North American tour to do and some other stops around the world. But using the studio completely as a tool, going down that Brian Wilson path, liberated them in a way that they hadn't been to that point. And you can argue about, was it a concept album? Well, it's a concept album because we said it was, but it wasn't really. Maybe the concept is there is this element of, we're free, we're the Beatles, we've got a blank check to basically create anything we want to. It doesn't have to be a collection of songs a la what we've done to this point. There's almost a stage presentation aspect to it, because they were very conscious of, we're not going to tour, we're not going to set foot on a stage again. So, as Paul said, the album is going to go out on tour. This is going to represent what you would be experiencing if you want a live experience. This is it, with the faux concert underpinnings at the very beginning and reprised at the end. So, to me, the more I mature and look back at Pepper and where it stands in the Beatles' body of work, it is very much a one-off. It's very much a conscious sort of almost theatrical production, which is a very different approach to album making as they did before to that point, and as we do going forward. As Ringo had pointed out, White Album, we'd gotten the madness out of our system. That was us going back to being a band again. And he saw that more as the follow-up to Revolver than Pepper ever was. So you can love and respect Pepper. There's all the cultural implications and importance in its day. If you weren't alive in 67 listening to the Beatles, there is all its import as this sort of sonic experiment of, we're not the Beatles anymore, we're Sgt. Pepper's band. And this is our palette. It's as wide and as deep as we're able to create in this moment. It's still us folks, but it's not the normal collection of rock songs that you've experienced from the Beatles to this point. It's hard for me to put this all into words. I can sort of feel it and I understand it, but I'm hoping it's coming across that it's important because it's like a completely different approach to making records than they ever would again. Maybe Abbey Road is the closest thing that sort of did returning to that, but not quite the same thing.
You're absolutely right, Robert, about this album being a one-off. It's almost anomalous. I mean, you could almost imagine going right from recording Revolver into recording the White Album, right? But Pepper is there, and it's the experimentation that covers the rock band that's churning underneath. I mean, the title track and then the reprise are as tight a rock. I mean, that's the track Jimi Hendrix covered right away. That is the minor pentatonic blues that McCartney had in his blood. But it is so covered by all the effects and the things that critics pointed to as, oh, it's so serious. Whatever happened to the fun music the Beatles put out that we could dance to and so forth. But they were serious about guitars too. And I started from the truism that George doesn't play much guitar in Pepper, but how I discovered, well, he's really all over the instrument. There's talk about the title track that when it came time to dub the guitar solo for Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, Jeff Emerick especially, who has a thing against George's guitar playing, but others as well, note that he spent hours tracking guitar leads for the title song, only to have McCartney dub over it, which was sort of Paul's thing he could do sometimes. And I think I found possible evidence for that in the guitar dub track. On that track 3 of the reduction mix on which they did the guitar solo, on track 3, they first recorded the French horn quartet in several places. And then they wanted to record the guitar on the same track. And so the tape operator, I promised something about Richard Lush, it was his job as it was Ken Scott's on parts of the White Album. Richard Lush had to punch in when McCartney would start playing the solo, and he had to punch out when McCartney was done with the solo, but he had to be very careful to punch out before the horns started, or they would lose that forever. It was very easy to lose prior work with these punch-ins and punch-outs. Now, there are several punch-ins of the guitar solo on the horn track, and the first one is very, very clean. It's brilliant. McCartney ends, Lush punches out, the horns come right in. But on the third pass, it's really sloppy, and you hear McCartney punched out, and then you hear another guitar punched out, and then the horns come in. Now, it might be that that was McCartney's second attempt or third or fifth attempt at that particular spot in the solo, but something was on that tape. Some guitar was on that tape before McCartney dubbed his solo, and you can tell from the ragged punch out there. So let me play that track. Just that little glitch before the horns come in. That was a prior take of guitar solo that McCartney dubbed over with his final solo.
Do you know how many times I've tried to replicate that, not knowing that that was a punch?
Yeah. Yeah, and it's all that mechanical operation in the control room again. You'd never have to go through that in digital recording, but, we have all these odd artifacts. That might have been George's last remnant of Pepper guitar solo. Who knows?
Have you ever heard there's an isolated track of Instant Karma? We'd known for years that George was at the session and that supposedly he played guitar on the track, but was completely unapparent in the finished recording, right? There's no guitar. It's all piano and echo and drums. But if you hear this track, it's got a longer fade out before it finally comes to an end. And in the final seconds of it, you hear some lead guitar doodling that is unmistakably George. And it just makes you wonder what the whole rest of the track must have sounded like, his entire performance, before they decided to make that decision.
He could have been playing through the whole track and it was all muted out. Interesting. I don't remember ever hearing that.
As long as I've been listening to the Beatles, every time that now we're focusing on Sgt. Pepper for our fall semester, primarily with a little help from my friends, fixing a hole and getting better. I'll always be a fan of the Beatles, right? But as a musician, as I keep coming back to this stuff, I keep relearning something that I thought I knew, but now I know it better. Or I keep learning, whether it's in the songwriting process, the musicianship, the recording process. It's pretty great. It's always great. And with Cameron and Walter, I mean, those guys, they just keep turning out amazing content for this class. We're going to talk about the guitars of Pepper. I couldn't help, as I was looking at, with a little help from my friends, to all of a sudden start looking at Brian Wilson's influence on McCartney. So I want to talk a little bit about that as well. So it's going to be a bit of a hodgepodge on Pepper, but primarily the guitars. And we'll let Walter kick it off.
I guess I started with a truism that George Harrison was concentrating on the sitar and tambura, his Indian music. And it's said by many that he doesn't play much guitar on Pepper. And of course, Paul does play quite a bit. We hear the tambura on 3 tracks. So the Indian side of things does vie for attention with the guitar. But I don't think it's bearing out. I think George does a lot of guitar work on Pepper, and the documentation on who plays what is abundant, but it's not consistent. It's often conflicting what different documents and people have to say. So Jack and Cameron and I have tossed around a couple of really thorny spots for which we don't have final answers, but it's high time to have a conversation on some of these points anyway, if we don't have final answers. And what I did for today, to kind of give a flavor of the kinds of things we might talk about in our Sgt. Pepper class this fall, is when we decided to concentrate on guitar in Pepper, I worked up some edits of some Pepper guitar passages that will hopefully lead to some interesting discussion. So let's start with Lucy in the Sky, and the guitars are played by George. He played his Gibson acoustic electric in the basic track, and to my ear, it sounds like it's mic'd from the amp. George taped that acoustic guitar without any effects, and we hear it in warm-up and in strumming each beat in the pre-chorus. So let me play that. This might be an early take. So in the pre-chorus, it's very easy to hear. It's featured as one of the few sounds you hear strumming on every beat in the Cellophane Flowers lines. In the chorus, George Martin comes in on the piano and really covers the acoustic guitar a bit, but it's still there. George is strumming away through the chorus as well. Now, when this acoustic guitar was mixed with the other basic track instruments, right? Paul's Lowrey, Ringo's drum, John maracas and guide vocal, that was taped over by George's tambura overdub, George Martin's piano. When all of those things were mixed to a single track in the first reduction, George's acoustic guitar was given artificial double tracking, ADT, and it was just very slight. The two signals were just slightly out of phase with each other, which creates the phasing sound that you hear on all the mixes of Lucy. It's pretty subtle. The phasing is much more noticeable in Lucy on the vocals, but it is still audible on the guitar track. So listen to this example of the guitar with the phasing. It's most prominent after you hear John sing, "Take You Away." Then listen very carefully for the acoustic guitar after that, and you may hear the phasing in there. Right, it's got that Itchycoo Park whoosh sound to it. And it's present through the track, but you can hear it best in those pre-chorus phrases after John finishes singing, then the acoustic guitar.
Do you get the sense that that was a deliberate effect they were going for?
It must have been, because they experimented with all different kinds of artificial double tracking. They'd used it for a couple of albums already. And usually, of course, for the express purpose of not having to manually double track a vocal. Instead of actually singing the part twice, it was worked out so that Jeff Emmerich came up with this device and Ken Townsend came up with this device to use a second tape recorder to delay the signal by increments that will have the second signal either very, very close to the first one or further away. And you can have it very close, like in the phasing effect, when the wave shapes are fighting each other. Each beat is shaped by this conflation of antagonistic waveforms. One goes up while the other one comes down, in other words, and they kind of cancel each other out in a very irregular way. So they found artistic ways to use the ADT, as well as just simply the time saver of the artificial double tracking. And all through Pepper, if you look at Kehew and Ryan's book, Recording the Beatles, they have a good list of the tracks, or at least most of the featured tracks that use ADT in different ways at different speeds. And Pepper is just all over those lists. It was part of the experimentation. They were deliberate. They might not have known exactly how it would sound until they tried it. But there it is, yeah. And they didn't do another mix. You know, that pre-mix, that was the one they liked with that phasing in it.
Just seems like a lot of things were happy accidents with them that they ended up employing, that they weren't necessarily knowing in advance what would happen. It's like, wow, that's amazing. That's cool. We're going to keep that.
Right. Yeah. And you run into that in the documentation. Something will happen, a stray sound or an accidental tone setting on something.
Blue Nun Y bottles on a Leslie speaker.
Yeah. And it's one of the great things. They were so open to accidents. It's like Paul Simon is one of my other favorite rock musicians who talks about the happy accident as driving his composition. But it was definitely true of the Beatles, especially in the studio. So that's the acoustic guitar effect in Lucy. And then, of course, George dubbed his two electric guitar effects on the track. He plays a slide guitar doubling John's vocal on the pre-chorus, and he adds a fuzzed guitar routed through a Leslie speaker, doubling Paul's bass guitar in the choruses. George said, "You could hear the guitar playing along with John's voice. I was trying to copy Indian classical music. They have an instrument called a sarangi, which sounds like a human voice, and the vocalist and sarangi player are more or less in unison in a performance." George Martin talks about when he arranged the violins and cellos for Within You, Without You, he mimicked the sliding techniques of the Dilruba players on that track to get that Indian flavor. And so that's what George brings to the pre-choruses in his guitar playing in Lucy.
That's a rather substantial contribution for a guy who conventional wisdom says didn't have a whole lot to do with that album.
Exactly. Lucy is a special thing, though. I mean, they spent an entire evening just rehearsing it, trying to figure out how do we do this? What organ do we play here? What organ stops do we use on the Lowry? John and George, are they both going to play their casinos? Or all the photographs from the Life magazine photographer that came out, 250 photographs from that evening session. It's a wonderful way to see all the things that they went through. And George figures very prominently in all those rehearsal setups. So he plays the slide part, doubling John's voice in the pre-chorus. And then in the chorus, he doubles Paul's bass with a fuzz effect run through the Lowry. And Geoff Emerick says, we had decided to route George Harrison's guitar through a Leslie speaker during the choruses. So that gets to your question about being deliberate, because the way Emerick puts it, and there are all kinds of thoughts on Emerick's memory and his value as a storyteller, but he says we had decided to route George's guitar through Leslie, and I hadn't heard it put that way anywhere else. So let's listen to George's electric guitar in the pre-chorus and then the chorus. This raises a question that I don't have an answer for. I just have a question. Did George play the parts in two passes? Or is it possible that an engineer helped switch the signal chain between pre-chorus and the chorus? I'm not aware of a single pedal, say like Kurt Cobain used to go from one rig to another with a simple foot pedal, or John had used the Vibrolux pedal in Don't Bother Me that switches the tremolo on and off. So a little bit of signal path adjustment with a pedal there, but nothing like this.
Could it be, Walt, that if it's going through the Leslie and it's going through a preamp and you just turn the speed off so it's just the tone cabinet, and then you hit the switch on the preamp that makes the speaker spin? Is that an option?
Yeah, you certainly don't have to play with a slide technique, but you could play with the same guitar and play in the chorus. There's the dirt also that's thrown in there, and that could be a compressor turned on and off or some kind of effect like that. The thing is, he recorded both of those guitar lines on the same track that McCartney's bass plays straight through. Although they would do vocal parts a section at a time, notoriously, and Think for Yourself, and a number of other tracks as well. I want to think McCartney played the bass line all the way through, not in fits and starts, one section at a time. So if Harrison is playing on the same track as McCartney's bass, he's very likely doing it live all the way through. But I would think he would need some help changing the path.
Is this the first example that we have of George Harrison playing slide guitar?
Might be. Of course, it's McCartney on Drive My Car, right? The slide guitar in Strawberry Fields is actually on the Mellotron. And that was George Martin as well as McCartney doing those slides on Mellotron.
Because it's a very good slide playing, to imitate that vocal like that. And even,
yeah, it probably comes from his sitar training. Cameron, do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, and there's a picture of him much earlier playing slide with a lighter or something, right? There's a photograph of him. It looks like it's from '64 of George Harrison. He's got the short hair and the button down.
Yeah. Wow. Wonder what track that would have been.
Yeah, I'm not aware of that.
Probably just goofing around, I don't think it's on anything.
No, I don't think it was recorded.
Yeah, pretending he's an old blues legend, Leadbelly or somebody.
There's Paul in '64 with the capo on his bass.
Yeah.
Love that one, yeah.
So, another thing about Lucy, despite the big D minor chord, that big D minor chord, that's where you hear the piano enter, by the way, Martin crashing on that D minor chord to start the pre-chorus. despite that, it's all major mode, right? The verses in A major, and then the pre-chorus is in B flat major, and then in G major. So it's very G major, and we'll take note of the major or minor tonality in these tracks because it marks Pepper as being a pretty big turn from Revolver and Rubber Soul, which had both drawn heavily from the blues. There's not as much blues language in Pepper. It's a lot of major mode and some diatonic modes like Mixolydian and Dorian feature, and some actual minor key. But the minor pentatonic, very few instances. So we'll listen for that.
I'm just going to add the psychedelic experience with that track. Through my experience of hearing that record high on LSD when I was younger, what you refer to as that phasing, when that was happening, it's like your senses are heightened under that drug. So when you're listening to that song and you're hearing that phase and you're hearing the tambor come in and out, it really becomes a body sensation. Whether they did that on purpose, but they must have been very pleased with the effect of like, wow, that feels great and it sounds great, because they were high on LSD, whether they were doing it when they were recording or afterwards. I imagine they probably listened to it on LSD and gave thumbs up, be like, yep, this is exactly what we wanted.
Well, I've written about She Said, just sounding like trails with all the imitation. And certainly what you point to about the phasing, and that's very closely related to the visual trails that are one of the first signs that the acid's kicking in, right?
Yeah, but you also get these body sensations where you feel like it moves through you. And listening to that album, when that happens, because it happens in Getting Better, it happens in Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, whether it's the tambor or whether it's the phase thing that we're talking about, it was always like, who has the best stereo that we can go and listen to and like drop acid?
I remember particularly a friend, this would have been in 1976. He had found a German pressing of Pepper. And this was, I think, before I'd heard the British pressings. And he said, listen to the phasing in Lucy. 1976, I'd never heard any reference to it before that. But, to step back from the drug experience, because we all know LSD had nothing to do with the creation of Lucy, right? George Martin talked about Strawberry Fields being Debussy with all the attention to tone color. But for me, Lucy is the peak of the Beatles' attention to tone color. The way the tambura and the cymbals and the odd combination of music box sounds on the Lowrey, they blend together, they go in and out, the cymbal and Ringo's very subtle changes of drum patterns. Everything works together to create like blends of sounds, especially the way Lennon, his vocal is recorded. First, you hear it fast, and then in the pre-chorus, you hear it even faster. And does it go from one to the other? No, they overlap. The two vocals overlap just before the pre-chorus comes in, and it just blends the vocals. And it's just, I don't know, that could be a happenstance. Whether it's deliberate or not, I don't know. But I think the colors of Lucy are just amazing. I don't think there's anything else like it.
I'm glad you touched on the vocals because that was going to be my question. Is I always felt like I was hearing a very speed, at least on the pre-chorus vocal, that it sounded unnatural, but it completely fit the color of the song and all that stuff. So I'm glad for you to confirm that.
Yeah, well, Lucy is a journey. It's a search. Lennon is searching for Lucy, and he finally finds her in the chorus, right? But as he's looking, as he's searching, he's going down the rabbit hole. He's getting deeper and deeper into this magical, mystical world. And the vocal starts out fast, but then when it gets faster, you are on a journey going somewhere. And that B flat comes out of nowhere. That's a very unusual tonal center for a song in A major, too. So it all works together to suggests this we're leaving reality behind and we're getting further into the strangeness.
Did McCartney have anything to do with the writing of that song, or is that all Lennon?
Lennon has said that Paul contributed to some of the lyrics, yes.
Right.
It's almost a better story that John just wrote Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds himself, that it's attributed to LSD, etc., etc., all the little legends that have grown up about it. But unfortunately, it's just not true. You know, that I was there and we had a great session because we loved the subject matter. I came out with newspaper taxis. He'd parry go with a Looking Glass Eyes. I'd come out back with Kaleidoscope or whatever this. Cellophane, it's always been a favourite word of mine, that cellophane. But so that was basically the idea.
But not the music.
McCartney says, well, it wouldn't be in the lyrics book. I don't think the song's written about there. But maybe in many years from now, McCartney says that he always liked the word cellophane as a child. And McCartney is so tuned into the sounds of words, right? It's evident in so much of his lyrics. But cellophane flowers and newspaper taxis, I think those are the phrases that McCartney is credited by Lennon with kicking in. And they were writing nose to nose then. You know, McCartney came up with cellophane flowers, and then Lennon would say, oh, of yellow and green. And so they were piecing the lyrics together. McCartney did have some input there. And then the other question is, he's playing the Lowry. Is he also playing the Vox Continental? Is that just two different manuals on the Lowry? I vote for Vox Continental in the chorus because it has a sustain that the Lowry doesn't have. The one reason they like the Lowry is that the pitches die away. They won't, it's not like this where it'll hold forever. The pitches die away unless you use a preset to take off that sustain. So I hear that as a Vox Continental. I hear McCartney is playing two different keyboards there, along with George Martin's piano. So the sonic palette is immense.
To refer back to a show that you guys did earlier on SatB, I forget who was leading the discussion, maybe it was you, Jack, on Lennon's use of single note melodies and Julia being the champion of that.
That was Cameron. We were comparing McCartney and Lennon melodies.
Thank you for correcting me, Cameron. Yes. And that was eye-opening for me. I was always aware that he kind of tended toward that, but I never went through the catalog to see where he did it the most. But when you listen to Lucy and the verses are the picture yourself, it's another sort of within one note range, which is in such direct contrast to that lovely opening Lowry melody. And to circle back to your question, Jack, did Paul have any input? I'd always felt in my heart without knowing that opening line had to be Paul coming before John's sort of mono range vocal line. I don't know if Walter has any further input on that, but that was always what I suspected.
Yeah. Lennon in the first take does sing that as just one single repeated pitch. At some point, it developed into having several pitches. McCartney takes credit for telling John, sing that quicker, because Lennon had been singing it very on the beat, very marcato. And McCartney had him free up the rhythm. They didn't have any better way of conveying that than sing it quicker, I guess. But I think McCartney prodded John to add a little bit more variety to the rhythm, if not to the pitch.
But the opening line, that dun 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 dun, who do you think came up with that?
Well, that was McCartney. I imagine Lennon was just strumming an A major chord, and they were fascinated with that descending bass line, and so. And of course, it's that great suggestion of major 4-chord to minor 4-chord that they make a lot of use of throughout their career.
You and I have talked in the past about how we wish there was an acoustic demo of this song in the same way that there is for Strawberry Fields, because you can hear how Paul McCartney's keyboard part transformed the opening of Strawberry Fields from something kind of strummy to something much more voice leading, classical, melodic sounding thing. So we kind of assume something similar happened with this song too, but we don't know how it started exactly.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it would have been great if they had taped that whole evening of rehearsals and be a fly on the wall for that session. I can't imagine another session I'd rather have witnessed, really. I could go on about Lucy forever, but there are a couple of documents, manuscripts of Lennon's and Mal Evans' lyrics, and one by McCartney as well. It's one of the very, very few manuscripts that has any indication of what instrument plays when. McCartney writes drums, cymbals, organ, piano, and I think by that he's referring to the Vox Continental because it's in the chorus, or maybe that's where he was thinking George Martin should be playing more. And a couple of indications of the tonal movement. It says D to A at the end, and that's how they get back from G to A major. So it's a pretty cool document of work that they gave quite a bit of thought into, so much that they didn't want to lose something they had decided to do.
Knowing what you know overall musically in the Beatles' career and their artistic trajectory, do you see, when you look at the construction of Lucy, any forward movement for what they've been doing to that point in terms of more sophistication? Or do you see this as just another recasting of tricks they already had used to a greater effect in this piece of psychedelia?
Well, it's a further step in a number of ways. Lennon had written about an acid trip and She Said, and he'd gotten pretty metaphysical with the Tibetan Book of the Dead and Tomorrow Never Knows. And he'd gotten quite mystical with A Day in the Life. But here, he goes back to the Alice books that he loved in his childhood. And in that way, it sort of reverberates with Strawberry Fields, sort of makes those two songs a pair. And, you know, I mentioned them as a pair in terms of tone color and instrumentation. But they both bring Lennon back to a time in his early childhood. I thought you were going to go in a direction like thinking about the Beatles' trajectory as performing musicians, because I suddenly started hearing Elton John and Lennon doing Lucy, which is where that trajectory sort of ended for Lennon, as far as I know.
Mm-hmm.
Well, should we go to Good Morning? So in take 8, Lennon plays the casino. He's chording on every beat through the verses, and he's chording on every beat through Paul's brilliant lead guitar solo and the refrains. But in the second bar of the bridge, he goes to a different rhythm. And I'm going to play this, see what you think of what Lennon is doing. After the first bar of the bridge, when he's just playing one chord per beat, he goes to a different pattern. That part, by the way, is totally buried in all the mixes. But under the brass, right, Sounds Incorporated and the drums and the bass. You can't hear this in the mixes, but now we can hear it as an isolated track.
Anthology 2 is so revelatory with this song.
Yes. Yeah. So what is it I think is so cool about that? The rhythm playing.
The rhythm is subdivided. So you got boom, 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 ba 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 ba.
Yeah, and what is that division? Triplets, yeah. 3 chords per beat. And it's not quite as fast as All My Lovin', but Lennon was so proud of his rhythm playing in All My Lovin', the triplets, every beat through the whole song. This is the only other instance of it I can think of. And Good Morning, and they bury it under Sounds Incorporated. Well, it's okay. It works. It's just there's so much richness in the Beatles, and you just get your shovel out and dig a little bit, and you find gold, right?
I had heard the Hey Jude album before I heard Sgt. Pepper in its entirety. So when I did eventually hear Good Morning, it was after having heard Lady Madonna. And that bit you're describing there reminded me of Lady Madonna. Lady Madonna, now knowing chronologically it came after, was a callback to that or something.
Yeah. The rhythm in Good Morning is a little bit more of a shuffle than in Lady Madonna, but it's the same kind of line Paul played on the bass a good bit after early 64.
It comes up in Fixing a Hole in the guitar part.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
That sort of line appears so many times. When we have our seminar and we're teaching guitar students, we focus on that line a lot. Cameron likes to say that it's the My Girl line, boom, boom, bum, bum. It's just changing the rhythm of it, but it outlines a major triad, and all three Beatles have used it a lot.
All right.
Yeah, and it's something you hear in New Orleans R&B, jump blues, Fats Domino, so many different iterations of rock and roll.
So it makes sense, the Lady Madonna connection.
That rhythm is present in John's demo also, which it sounds like the left hand on the piano, but supposedly he's playing a mellotron. He dubs a mellotron on top of that for the demo. And without Ringo, it doesn't have life, does it? It just sits there dead without Ringo, I think.
The song is so masked by the Sounds Incorporated brass.
Yeah.
That's like a wholly different song once you take that layer off.
When you listen to that chord progression in the verse, he plays this minor chord. You can hear it on the piano there. I don't know the chord progression in my head, but I can hear that minor chord.
Yeah. In A major, it's that E minor chord, which normally would be E major. So that's what puts the song in Mixolydian land.
What Robert says about this mask when you have all the instrumentation on top of it. So when the Beatles video game came out that had all those access to those isolated tracks.
Rock Band?
Rock Band, yeah. When the Fab Four got a hold of those, we heard that minor chord, and it was interesting because we tried to incorporate that as we were playing it. But if you focus on it, it doesn't work. It sticks out in a way that sounds wrong. But when you have all this other instrumentation on top of it, it makes sense. And it doesn't draw attention to it being that minor sonority so much, which is interesting, right? Because Pepper has so many layers on it. So when you break down the song like we're doing now, and you really get to hear the evolution of the songwriting, it's quite interesting to where it ended up.
Why don't we get to talk about Paul's guitar solo on the track then, with these Indian gamaks like he had played in Taxman. This is from the 2017 stereo mix. This is not my preferred mix, though, because Giles Martin went back to the original takes and flew them into his digital mix. And he missed out on some of the pre-mix action that Jeff Emmerich had done. The mix lacks a wow that Emmerich created by putting splicing tape on either the capstan or the pinch roller. The memories differ, which created a wow sound as the tape went past it. And it was not done while the guitar was being recorded. It was done in the first reduction. So all the original mono and stereo mixes have the resulting wow from that tape on the pinch roller. But Giles must have thought he was being a purist. Hey, we can knock out a layer of tape hiss by going to the original recording and flying that in. It's easy to sync up. But he missed out on that thing. And I admit, it's a very, very subtle thing. But I'll play from the 2009 mix. And I think it's most audible in the guitar after Lennon sings Meet the Wife, Time for Tea and Meet the Wife. And then you hear McCartney go up to the high note and sustain it. It's in that sustain. It sounds like a pitch bend in there, but it's because the tape is momentarily thrown out of whack in the tape transport in the premix. You hear that slight bend? I can't sing up there, so it doesn't help to try to illustrate it that way.
Who has the idea of putting tape on a capstan and know it will create a fantastic effect like that? How do you conceive that?
Yeah, to imagine that was an accident, that's some wild tape splicing that ends up with tape on the pinch roller, right? It's definitely Emmerich thinking, okay, John wants it to sound different, Paul wants it to sound different. What haven't I done yet? Kitchen sink problem, right?
Really a great example of an engineer like that being such a part of the sound. An engineer having their skill level so high that they're using the gear as an instrument.
Yeah. And it's all mechanical, right? It's not electronic. It's electronic and the tape is being read.
By that time, those engineers were using the tape machine in so many different ways, especially for this album, when they had to sync up those two 4-track machines. I guess it was Ken Townsend. It was like saying to George Martin on the day of, I'm going to need another 4 tracks tonight. Ken Townsend finishing his cup of tea and being like, okay, George, he has a few hours to figure it out. And he figures it out by using a tone generator on one of those tracks to be able to sync both of those machines. Physics, everything else. So yeah, for Geoff Emerick, any of those guys manipulating tape loops, putting a pencil or a pen somewhere along the line of the tape, just to make it more warbly or anything else, it's insane.
It's nuts. And Richard Lush was the tape operator through much of Pepper. We may point to his contribution to fixing a hole in there. So let's listen again. This is to hear the wow effect in McCartney's guitar solo. It's a subtle point, but again, it's something the Beatles approved, they wanted, and it doesn't come out in the 2017 mix.
I wonder how many people were driven nuts not hearing it in 2017.
I was like, wait a minute. No, it just came to me after much listening. Oh, about that shrieking guitar after Time for Tea and Meet the Wife. I love Jonathan Gould says, this represents an anguished, shrieking wife who was previously portrayed in a cymbal crash after Call His Wife In. Crash, Ringo. It's the crash there. It's obviously a misogynist effect to bring up, but Paul says in many years from now that John was having a lot of trouble with Cynthia at the time. So could be that strife comes out in the two references to the wife, especially with that shrieking wow effect there.
Paul, play me some Harpy Wife on guitar.
Yeah, exactly. Can you imagine? So, yeah, we mentioned the Mixolydian aspect of the song, which is, like She's Leaving Home is in a mode, and we have Dorian mode elsewhere. So, again, less minor mode presentations, but still not major mode there. Some variety. Should we go to Getting Better? And I think Cameron had some things he wanted to explore with this track.
Yeah, so this is one of the songs that we're teaching for our new class in October, our Sgt. Pepper class. And for the virtual band class, as we call it, we provide isolated tracks of the songs that we're going to work on, that they're going to do their own versions of, right? And for later material, there's Beatles isolated tracks available, so you can have just the bass or just the guitar. But in this period, that's not necessarily the case. So we record our own versions of these things, and we also transcribe it in any event. This is one of the songs that seems to have a lot of instrumental colors that are a little bit mushed together, So we've been doing some archaeology to try to dig and disentangle the individual guitar parts. And the peculiarity of this song, I think, is the almost obsessive repetition of one note, G. It has a droning effect. You can hear it on its own at the end of the song. So that's just G, right? And it fades out and it sort of makes you feel like it's going to go on forever. And, of course, Robert, you've talked about how the Beatles were getting into drones on Revolver to kind of create a sense of a drug-induced eternal present, like in Tomorrow Never Knows, or perhaps something that suggests a meditative state in George Harrison's Indian-influenced songs. The big difference with this particular drone is that it's not the tonic, it's not the home note, which in this case happens to be C, which is the same key as both Tomorrow Never Knows and Love You To. So that would be just staying on C. Both of those songs pretty much just stay on C. So there's a feeling of nothing happening harmonically, right? And that's part of what contributes to the feeling of timelessness, because there's no harmonic events. This song, the pedal is on G, which is the dominant. It's not the tonic. So it's the tension chord that has to resolve, like in classical music, it always has to resolve from the dominant to the tonic, and classical music, sometimes pieces will hang out for a very long time on the dominant. And that can happen for a long time, but it's always this feeling that you can't just end there. You got to go, you have to resolve to the tonic, right? So McCartney, if it's McCartney who is responsible for this aspect of the song, sort of has his cake and eats it too, because the whole verse is just this G pedal. It's not just in the upper parts. The whole verse is just G, and it has a droney kind of psychedelic Indian feel, but it also functions within the context of a pop song that uses traditional chords. And when it resolves is when the chorus comes in with the line, "It's getting better." So when that tension resolves, you really do sort of feel that it is getting better, perhaps without even knowing how the harmony is contributing to that feeling. So you'll hear in the beginning how the tonic is just briefly established in that vocal refrain, and then we go right into this long drone on G. And all the verses are the same. It's all just one chord. So that's the first thing, is that the drone is part of the songwriting. Like even if you played it on acoustic guitar or on piano, you would hear that droney quality even without fancy overdubs. But the Beatles then just ran with that and amplified it in the instrumental parts. Starting with the first take, you can hear Paul is playing this Hohner pianette, sort of like a Wurlitzer. And his part, even when he's playing the tonic chord, it's kind of hopping off of this. And then dominant. This is the verse, right? He's just playing different octaves of that, right? Really open sounding G's in different registers. So the G's there, and in the first take, you'll hear that probably John Lennon is playing a fuzz bass that just comes in on the top of the verse and just drones on G and only plays during the verse. And George Harrison is playing kind of a Chuck Berry-ish part that just only plays on the verse as well. So they're just living in this world of G and nowhere else. So you can hear how they both stop when the chorus starts, and we resolve to the tonic and the sun comes out, and those droney parts only exist in that droney world there. So, okay, a lot of G already, and then the overdubs start. That, what I just played you, wasn't the final take. I think the final take was like take 6. And John Lennon's fuzz part doesn't make it into the final mix, at least not audibly. But there is another part that you can hear that is also droning on G's, but it's a G here and then one here, and it sounds kind of like a fuzz guitar. They're separated, interestingly, by 2 octaves. So, like that's one G, that's a higher G that's not played, and then that 2-octave higher G. Perhaps you can hear this droney fuzz part playing these G's. So just to be able to hear it, we recorded our version of it, and this is our interpretation of just the part by itself, so you can hear it better. So, right, and then later on in the second verse, mostly just the note G that's in there. So that's part of that drone vibe. And then, of course, there's Paul McCartney's bass part, which I'll play in our version as well, so you can hear it isolated. So it's also just G in the verse pretty much. And interestingly, also separated by 2 octaves. So it goes from that G to that G. So a lot of bass players would be, they'd be going 1 octave. He goes a full 2-octave spread, which makes me think maybe he was responsible for that 2-octave spread guitar part, but who knows about that. So here's the bass part. See how it jumps up pretty high. Then further overdubs. This was recorded through the whole song, but it only ended up being used in the third verse, which kind of sounds like a bridge. George Harrison's tambura drone. Actually, I can play it sort of by itself. So more G pedal drone. So those are the overdubs pretty much on the verses. So what about the chorus overdubs? Well, how about more G repeated notes? As I said, the chorus doesn't have G as its chord, but they put all these G's on the chorus. For one thing, this octave guitar part that sounds like this. Right, and that's what you hear at the end. So that now is going through all the choruses and also through the intro part, which is, so there's G in the whole song, essentially, thanks to that part. And then one final G drone at the end. Speaking of, Walter's talking about changes of tone color. So all the different changes from the tambura to the pianette to the different guitar parts, and then finally to this last part that I'm going to talk about, keep that drone from getting monotonous because the tone color keeps changing. And the last one we think is someone, maybe George Martin, playing inside the piano, plucking the piano. to create that texture that we heard at the end. So I'll play that again from the stereo mix, and then I'll play our version of the individual parts so you can hear. So there's a conga in there, and then that jank, jank, jank guitar part that I already played you, and then something like this happening. Right, and that's with the guitar added into it. So those are the layers as I see them anyway, and it's just interesting to me how obsessively focused on one note the overdubs are, but how it fits within the context of this pop song that's not really droney. It's not exclusively droney. It's a very interesting kind of combination of psychedelia and pop.
And you read the interviews where they talk about Paul stating someday they want to write a one-note song.
There was always, right, this fascination with the one note, the endless drone, the ohm or whatever. Yeah.
Bullseye.
Where is that F chord that Harrison plays underneath the G?
Yeah, like in the beginning of the song, or what in getting so much, always during that part. Right.
At the very beginning, there's an F chord, right?
Right. There's an F chord, which is this. I'll play it. That's just a straight F chord, but it's combined with the octave guitar, which is playing the G. So it ends up being this kind of, I guess, a second chord or whatever you want to call it. It sounds like this.
Yeah, it's an F chord with a G in the guitar against it. And George Harrison would have called it an F with a G on top. That's how he described the Hard Day's Night chord.
It's similar to a Hard Day's Night chord. It's that same sonority. But is it in the demo where they're employing that F note first in the intro before it ends up becoming that chord?
Right. I don't think it was in the original conception of the song, because you can hear them singing getting so much in the background. So that I think they meant to have that sung there, which it isn't in the final version. But what's played isn't the F chord, and it isn't certainly the F plus G. It's just, I think, George Harrison playing a single low note F under it, which sounds like this.
Yeah. So again, these ideas as layering, even without studio trickery, they do it amongst themselves. I think that was a time with Pepper, so much in pop music was going on, and so I wanted to bring up Brian Wilson and Pet Sounds, how that influenced to what they were playing, because they were hearing other sonorities happening in pop music, especially in what Brian Wilson was doing on the piano, and these combinations, that's what made its way into Pepper. That's something I'll talk more about, but their ears were opening up at that time.
Yeah, run with that.
Well, when we were putting the resources together with a little help from my friends, I was reminded of what happens at the end, where McCartney on the piano, he plays a C chord, but he puts a G note in the bass. Here's an example. So if I play it on piano and you just hear a little bit of the last chorus that goes into the outro.
Give them that bass descent. Yeah.
But it's just this chord in particular, right? That's pretty new at that time. McCartney during Rubber Soul was playing more piano, but certainly Revolver, he's writing on piano. You can hear that. You can hear his invention and what he's doing on songs like For No One. He's making use of playing a triad in the right hand, but he's incorporating different notes in the left hand that aren't necessarily the root, something that Brian Wilson was definitely doing earlier on. When I hear this chord, I may not always love you, right? I so hear that. And I don't find that before in any other Beatles song. I mean, certainly, McCartney was doing other things, as I said, with the piano. But if I play just that chord progression for that middle section, for God Only Knows. That is something of its time that I'm sure with Burt Bacharach and Hal David, Four Seasons, there are other pop artists at that time that were using the piano and getting more sophisticated for sure. But when people say, Pet Sounds influenced Sgt. Pepper, I'd say Pet Sounds influenced McCartney, who found ways to employ some of these ideas on Sgt. Pepper. Certainly with one of the things that I love, and I say it again, I'll always be a fan of the Beatles, but as a musician, when I keep looking at this stuff, I can relate it to classical music. I certainly can relate it to, I'm more familiar with Bach than a lot of other classical composers when I think of counterpoint, and I think about, having that chord in the right hand and the opportunities that exist with the left hand. Of course, it has to make sense. I mean, you're not just going to play anything. And a lot of it is based on stepwise motion. And we see McCartney using that a lot from this point on, whether it's in Hey Jude, whether it's in Let It Be, whether it's in Hello Goodbye. I've spoken about this before, but I keep coming back to it because I really think it's important as part of like music education to, if you're interested, to understand how that works. It's not complicated by any means. It's all based on a major scale for the most part, but there's certainly some accidentals that go with that. Like if you just listen to the left hand of the piano for God Only Knows, you get the graph of what's happening because we know that song too. We can hear it. But if you listen to Beatles songs and you just listen to McCartney's bass playing, you're going to know the song. You're going to know the song because you know the song, but you also can hear McCartney, how he outlines that. And again, with this chord here that's used at the end of With a Little Help from My Friends, it's just another example how the Beatles were able to take their influences and incorporate it into their own music. They're not taking that whole passage, but it's certainly like paying attention to how can I use that chord in with the context of I'm writing this song or the sounds of combining different instruments. I think it was interesting to see those bass harmonicas on Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite. Certainly Pet Sounds, bass harmonicas were there. When we talk about layering and we talk about combining different instruments for Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, I think the world was opening up that time. They were getting from just being a rock and roll band to, of course, with George Martin's help, to more of an orchestrated listening environment. And Brian Wilson had to do that on his own. The Beatles had George Martin, and Brian Wilson had one ear, and he had himself. I love going back to what Brian Wilson was doing with the Smile recordings. I think bands that in the last 15 years or so have built their whole sound on just what Brian Wilson was doing at that time with the amount of reverb or combining unlikely instruments. This tune, Cabanescence, is a perfect example. How many instruments did we just hear there? Piano, banjo, flute, harmonica, and whatever that low tone is. I don't know if it's a foot pedal on an organ or if it's something else. But those colors, of course, those colors happening with just great songwriting and just great arrangements. So I just wanted to touch upon that a little bit with the layering, and we could spend a whole episode just dedicated to that period of time. Brian Wilson, Paul McCartney, those two records, those three records, without a doubt. It's something, when we do our course, we start talking about harmonic issues. We start talking about not only how to play certain parts, but what the influences are and what else was going on at that time. I think it's always important to look back when Beatle records were made and see, well, what else was going on at that time? I think it's one of the things why Beatle records stand out, whether it's for the songwriting or whether it's for sonic reasons. one of the other things we were doing, getting back to the Pepper guitars. Now, this is really interesting because for the longest time, playing Fixing a Hole, always just tuning down the low E to a D string so you can finish the solo with those low notes, right? So Cameron had come across this video because no matter what we're doing, we can go with what we think is how it's played, but whether we're researching it on the web or we're looking on YouTube to see if anybody else has ideas, Cameron came across this fellow, Marcus Phelan, Phelan, this British guy, has just a few hundred hits on his YouTube demonstration of Fixing a Hole, where he tunes the guitar down a complete whole step. And when I was trying to figure out the solo, we have the isolated track. And I wasn't fully convinced that I had it right, because when the guitar solo starts, you hear this note that's ringing out. You hear the F note. The song is in F minor. The solo is in F minor. So it's basically an F minor blues pentatonic solo. But you hear this F ringing out. Now, if the guitar is tuned in standard pitch, you can't find an F note that rings out and be able to execute that solo from start to finish. And I was chalking it up. Maybe that's just some overdrive or something that's happening in the harmonics and the overtones that are just happening with the distortion, the guitar, and all these other things, right? But there was just something inside me that's like, that's not right. I'm kind of like just accepting it. So when Cameron found this video, I was just completely blown away because it makes sense. So if I play the solo now, you will hear my demonstration of double track, because we know that the solo was double tracked. But you're going to hear with the guitar all the way tuned down of how I can get it to happen. Yeah, so that's not through a Vox amp. I'm not George Harrison or Paul McCartney. I don't have a Neumann on it. It's not Abbey Road. So, we do our best to replicate these sounds with the right kind of pedals, the right kind of guitar. But finding that video of Marcus playing that down a whole step, that's just it. Because again, as a musician that listens to this music, that tries to replicate it, I try to incorporate some of these ideas into my own work. If I find the right way to play it, it's easier to play and it makes sense. Plus the line that happens, boom, 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 boom. With just the low D string tuned down and not the rest of the guitar, it's very awkward for your hands to do that. But when the whole guitar is tuned down, it falls exactly where it should.
Let me get my guitar, Jack, and you tell me what you think. Where's the F that you hear ringing out in the track?
No, it's this F. It's down there. So there's kind of like I'm a little out of tune because I just tuned down a whole step. It's that open string ringing. So it's the G string.
I see.
But it's playing an F. And then it sounds like someone's sliding into those two notes, which if you're not tuned down a whole step, you can't slide because the notes that you're sliding from would be open strings and you'd have to hammer in.
So that would help. And yeah, you have to tune the whole guitar down. You can't just tune that low string. And Cameron, you were talking about this slide.
Oh, yeah, that's another mystery. Yeah. How are you doing that?
I'm just sliding down with my index finger and middle finger.
Let me play the isolated track for a second, and it's kind of obvious. Right there, you hear that ringing out. You can't do that unless the guitar is tuned down a whole step. You can't do that. And this guy, Marcus, makes a point, in his opinion, that it's McCartney because he's getting into the whole Taxman the Indian thing again with the drone. Whether it's McCartney, whether it's Harrison, it's definitely tuned down a whole step. So that was really fun. That was really fun to discover that. Out of all these years that I've been playing and listening to that track, here I am again finding something new in a Beatles song that I didn't know before, So We're going to have a lot of fun this semester concentrating on, with a little help from my friends, fixing a hole and getting better. And we'll touch upon a bunch of other Sgt. Pepper topics and songs. You know, the first 45 minutes is open to everybody. We love having this roundtable discussion that you don't have to be a musician to participate. We just kind of get into the deeper dive of the song structure, or it could be just the cultural part of it. And then the second half, we break out into these virtual bands that we supply these isolated tracks, and we help coach students to learn the parts and play them. Walter has his part of the class where he branches off and he digs more into the harmonic structure and the songwriting and the recording process. You're going to be our guest on November 6th. And that'll be wonderful. It's always great having you part of that. So our semester starts October 2nd, and we do 6 consecutive Mondays, 5:30 to 7 p.m. Eastern Time. And yeah, Sgt. Pepper.
And the classes are recorded. So if someone can't join us in real time, we make the recordings of the meetings available to whoever signs up. We have people enrolled in Europe and, West Coast, wherever.
It's amazing when you think about it now with what you guys have demonstrated here, how much of a guitar album Pepper is. You can talk about the brass, you can talk about the Indian instrumentation, the layers of production, the effects and all that. But at the bottom of it, it seems, is still that guitar band that started playing in Liverpool and then Hamburg. That's something that they never fully left, even with something as elaborate as Pepper.
I love that. And I love that Cameron points out the Chuck Berry influence in Getting Better, because these guys have a vocabulary that was built on early rock and roll.
I'm not sure Cameron mentioned that George is... it's so tied in with the pianette. It's hard to pick out unless, you've got that isolated track and you're really honed in. There's that. And then there's this other distorted guitar with hammer-ons going on above that. There's so much going on with guitar on the album, and some of it just gets buried over and mixed in the wash.
That's a great point. I mean, I feel like there's a rock band cooking underneath all that, and it sometimes does get a little bit buried.
Something About the Beatles. Created and hosted by Robert Rodriguez. Executive producer Rick Way. Title song by The Chords.